It's great to be here with you, to be able to worship with you this morning. It's just good to be able to be in the house of God and to be able to, just hear the way that you guys share the gifts that God's blessed you, to be able to bless the rest of us, and to just in singing and hearing your testimonies and just all the gifts that God's given you, the blessings He's given to us. It's amazing. So we're we're talking about this idea of a snake, and that's the passage that Manny just read for us. It comes from Genesis 3, the story of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden, God creates the world. He creates everything in it. He creates this special garden that He puts the first human and the second human, Adam and Eve, in the garden, and everything about this garden is good. And that God's created them with a special purpose, that they would obey God and that they would partner with God to rule in God's image over the animals. But then there's a test in the garden. There's this tree that they're told, don't eat from that tree. And ultimately, instead of obeying God and ruling over the animals, they listen to a rebellious snake and they disobey God. And so the image of God in them is lost, or at least stained deeply. And instead of living like God, instead of trusting in God's wisdom, and instead of living life the way that God wants them to live, they start living impulsively. And people start living like animals instead of living like God. We start acting impulsively. We have this idea that we're supposed to just follow our heart, right? We're supposed, and sometimes we mean something really like, oh, have this big grand dream, and no matter what, I'm going to overcome and persevere and try to achieve that dream. And then there's this other version that we have of following our heart, where it's just whatever I feel like doing in the moment, I'm going to do no matter what, and no one can tell me nothing about it. But both of those are flawed. Both of those ultimately are trusting in our own wisdom, our own ideas. So that's kind of the story of the Garden of Eden, and that's ultimately the story that sets up the rest of the Bible, that even though God creates this good world, it falls, and we've lost our spot that God's created for us, but God wants us to restore us. And so in that passage, Genesis 3:15, God promises, I'm not going to leave humanity on its own, but I'm going to provide a way back home, back to the garden. I'm going to send someone who's going to be the snake slayer, the person who's going to kill a snake. And that brings us to the story of David, which when I've been having the opportunity to preach here, I've been going through a series over the life of David. And so for those of you who have been here, you've maybe remember some of those previous stories. We looked at the anointing of David, how God anoints David for the special purpose through the prophet Samuel. Then we looked at the fall of Saul, David's predecessor, and how ultimately he loses his trust in God and decides to turn to this evil that's represented here by the snake. But now we're beginning really the story of David in earnest. And we're still going to look throughout this series and today how David is this type of the Messiah. He's not the ultimate Messiah, but he's pointing us forward to that ultimate Messiah in Jesus. And we're going to look today how David slays the snake. And this is a really interesting story. You've probably heard the story at some point of David versus Goliath in your life, right? It's a very common story. It's kind of a story of the ultimate underdog, right? David, this little boy, kills the giant Goliath against overwhelming odds. But there's more to the story than meets the surface. There's more nuance, more depth to the story than we sometimes recognize on the surface. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time diving into the story in the Bible. If you want to follow along with the Bible in front of you or on your phone, you can do it. We're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 17. And don't worry, I'm not scrolling through Twitter, but I was not able to print off my notes last night, so that's why I have my phone open to remind me of what verses to read, etc. So anyway, 1 Samuel chapter 17, starting in verse 5, or verse 4. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, from the city of Gath. His height was 6 cubits and a span. That's various estimates give that. How big was a cubit? We're not exactly sure, but he's tall. He's somewhere between 8 to 9 feet tall, probably. He's a giant. And what does it say about him? He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he is armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of the spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. This is an intimidating man. Goliath comes out. He's a challenge. He's going to challenge Israel. He's going to defy them. One thing that's really interesting here is the word, it says he has chainmail. Really what it says in the original is that he has scaled armor. So he has scales. The Bible here is trying to emphasize he looks like a snake. He's wearing scaled armor, just like a snake has scaled. I don't know if you noticed, but in verses 5 and 6 there, it mentions that he's wearing bronze 4 times. Bronze helmet. Bronze, his coat is made of bronze. Bronze armor on his leg, a bronze javelin. 4 times bronze is mentioned. And you're like, why? Okay, so what? Why does that really matter? Is the author just really fixated on letting us know there's bronze? Why? And the reason for that is because the word bronze in the original language is the word neheshet, which sounds an awful lot like the word nahesh, which is the word for snake. So bronze sounds like the word snake here. So not only is he wearing scales like a snake, but his armor is like a snake because it's nahesh. It's a snake-like armor. Goliath is the snake in the grass. Goliath is a snake, and he's coming to challenge Israel, to defy them. Verse 8, it says, Then he stood, Goliath, and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail over against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants, and you will serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. This is exactly why Israel had wanted a king. When Israel went to Samuel originally and said, Give us a king, what they said was, we want a king that's going to go fight our battles for us. We want a king who's going to lead us, that's going to represent us in battle. We want to be like the other kings. This is the whole purpose of why Saul has been named king, is to be able to, for moments like this, fight Israel's battles for them. But here in this great moment of test, Saul is cowering. He's scared. In verse 16, we're told that this happens like this for 40 days. Every day for 40 days, Goliath, this snake-like warrior, comes out and he yells terrible things. He challenges Israel, and Israel, including Saul, everyone there is cowardly. No one there is willing to step up and take on the challenge. And there's a lot of significance to this idea of it being 40 days and 40 nights. Like 40 days, morning and evening, he goes out. This number 40 is a number that's repeated a lot in the Bible. 40 is always a symbol of some kind of big test that's happening. It's a testing time. It's a testing. Something big is going to happen at the end of 40 days. There's going to be a test. It goes in the garden, or not the garden, in the wilderness. Israel wanders for 40 years before they go into the promised land. Far later on, Jesus is going to be in the desert for 40 days before he's tested by the snake, Satan. So 40 days, Israel is being tested. Saul is being tested. Saul is being given this opportunity to step up and do what he's supposed to do as king. But for 40 days, him and the rest of the Israel army is afraid. No one is willing to step up and accept this challenge. Everyone here is failing the test. And then Jesse sends out David to go check on his brothers, to bring him cheese and bread. And now I'm not going to say anything against being a vegan. Like, I think it is the ideal diet, but it is interesting that the only time in the Bible that cheese is mentioned, it's mentioned as a good thing. So maybe it's important to be a little bit less harsh towards those who aren't vegans. That's all I'm saying. Veganism is good, by the way. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying maybe we would have rejected David too, some of us, because he's bringing cheese. So let's be a little bit grace-filled in how we view the people who are about to reject David and his mission in a little bit. So David goes, he brings cheese to his brothers, and in verse 23, it says, "Then as he talked with him," David talking with his brothers and with the other soldiers, "there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath, coming up from the armies of Israel, and he spoke according to the same words, so David heard them." Verse 24, "And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, 'Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from all taxes in Israel.' Then David said to the men who stood by him, 'What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away this reproach from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?' And the people answered him, saying, 'So shall it be done for the man who kills him.'" So here we see there's this big difference I want to just pause and highlight between being rash and being confident. Saul, throughout his reign as king, very often is very rash. He's impulsive. He just does whatever feels good to him. And we think sometimes that that's the same thing as having confidence. We think that being rash, just doing whatever I want, no one can tell me nothing, like that's the same thing as having confidence. But it's clearly not, because Saul is cowering. So there's really not that much confidence. His rashness is not the same as confidence. But David here has confidence. He already assumes that God can give him the victory. And why is that? It's because the rest of Israel views Goliath's challenge as a challenge towards them, their own pride, their own ego, their own ability to fight, their own skills. That's how they view the challenge of Goliath. But David doesn't do that. If you notice, he says, "and that he should defy the armies of the living God." David views this as Goliath challenging God. So David doesn't have to have confidence in his own great skill set or abilities, but David rather has confidence that it's God who's going to give him victory. How do we view the challenges in life? Do we view them simply as like, these challenges I face, these are problems for me, and it's all about me that's got to solve these problems? Or do we view it in light of what God wants to do in our lives, and how can I honor God in this situation? How is it that I can somehow serve God and others, and how is it that God can work through me? And that humbleness, that trust in God that David has, is what leads him to have the confidence he needs to take on the giant Goliath. Continuing in verse 31, David's going around asking, he's trying to figure out how he can be the one to fight. Now when the words which David were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servants will go fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a youth, and he is a man of war ever since he was a youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from the mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the enemies of the living God, the armies of the living God." Moreover, David said, "The Lord who has delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." David's humbleness is contrasted here with Saul's cowardness. David has a skill set. He's fought animals before. He struck them down. he's developed this skill set that God's given him, these gifts that God's given him. David has worked hard to develop them, but David ultimately recognizing that's not his own skill set that's given him victories over these animals. He says that it's God who's given him the victory before. David gives his credit to God, and so when David faces a challenge greater than what he's ever faced before, David trusts that God once again will give him the victory. It's this humble trust in God that leads to this incredible confidence and faith that David can succeed where no one else is even willing to try. Continuing verse 38, it says, "So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet," there's that word bronze again, "on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, 'I can't walk with these, for I have not tested them.' So David took them off." It's interesting. Saul wants to dress David like himself, and really Saul's wanting to dress David like Goliath. He's dressing him in bronze. Saul has become convinced that this is the way to do things, that Goliath wants to fight hand-to-hand combat. David's willing to step up and challenge him, but David declines because David's not trusting in Saul and doing things the way that Saul wants to do them or doing things the way that Goliath wants to do them. But David is going to trust God. David's going to do things the way that God has blessed David with, using the skill set that God has given him in order to obey and follow God. And so David takes 5 stones and his sling against Goliath, this man who's dressed fully in armor, this man with these great, powerful, huge weapons. And so often the story of David and Goliath, it feels like it's the ultimate underdog story. This is probably how you've always heard the story, is the ultimate underdog story. But here's kind of the secrets that we almost never really talk about. And that's that this is not a story about an underdog at all. David is not the underdog, but David is actually the overwhelming favorite in this fight. If David had fought Goliath hand-to-hand combat, of course, Goliath would have won. Goliath would have been the favorite because Goliath was huge. He had a much larger reach, heavier, more powerful weapons. But David doesn't fight this on Goliath's terms. David doesn't allow Goliath, he doesn't allow the snake to tell him how to fight. But rather, David uses a ranged weapon, a sling, versus a melee fighter. And if you've ever seen the old Indiana Jones, and we're from Indiana, so I'm sure that's like the state movie, right? Maybe? I don't know. But there's that scene where this guy is coming and he's showing off all these moves and he's wanting to fight Indiana Jones hand to hand with his weapon, and he just pulls out a gun and shoots him. And he's just, I'm done. No, I'm not in the mood. And this is what happens. Goliath is expecting it to be hand-to-hand combat. And David's like, no, I'm going to fight you from a distance. And so God gives David this victory. But even more important than it being ranged versus melee, this is an arrogant man who's blaspheming God versus a humble servant of God who is fighting on God's behalf, and God is fighting through this man. And any time that arrogance goes up against God, God always wins. So this underdog story that we think about David and Goliath being is really not an underdog story at all. It's only an underdog story if David had done things the way that Goliath wanted him to do things. But when David uses the skill set God has blessed him with, and when David trusts God to be on his side, David becomes the overwhelming favorite in this fight. That's how things work in lives. If you want to kill a snake, you don't fight the snake on the snake's terms. I don't know if you guys have ever seen someone win a fight with a snake by laying on their belly and trying to bite the snake before the snake bites him. Have you guys ever tried that? I would highly recommend don't do that this afternoon or any afternoon. That's a bad way. That's a way to guarantee you lose the fight with the snake. You are not as quick with your mouth as the snake is. In the Garden of Eden, Eve loses this argument with the snake. Why? Because she tries to meet the snake on its own terms. She tries to be more clever than the most clever creature there is. And she loses. And she loses her trust in God. And then Adam doubles down on that mistake by also taking food from the snake. And between the two of them, they fall, and this tragedy of humanity begins. But if you want to defeat the snake, you don't fight the snake on your terms or on its terms, but you fight it on God's terms. You use a weapon. You keep the snake at a distance. If you want to beat a snake, you take some sort of stick or shovel or something that can keep the snake away from you, and you hit the snake before it ever has a chance to try to bite you. This is a great lesson for us in life of how do we have success over the evils in our lives? How do we defeat the snakes in our own lives? We have to keep a distance. We don't give ourselves a chance to be tempted. We don't purposely put ourselves on the snake's terms of fighting by purposely putting ourselves in spots where we can be tempted to do the wrong thing, but rather we keep our distance and we trust God and we do the right thing, and we trust that God's way is better than the snake's way of doing things. Verse 48 through 51, so it was when the Philistines arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistines. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his own sword, and drew it and killed him, and cut his head off with it. David crushes the snake. He cuts the head off of the snake. This is a story about how David is pointing us forward to Jesus. Ultimately, the way that Jesus defeats the ultimate snake. David is a type of the Messiah. He's a type of the chosen one, and he defeats a type of snake, this man who looks and dresses and acts like a snake, Goliath. But ultimately, the way Jesus, the ultimate Messiah, defeats the ultimate evil in Satan, there's actually kind of similar. It's not through a physical battle, but just like David refused to fight Goliath on Goliath's terms, Jesus refuses to fight the devil on the devil's terms. Jesus doesn't raise up an army and take over the world through battles and fighting. He doesn't overthrow. He doesn't start a rebellion. Rather, he very humbly submits everything to his Father. He has this radical trust in God, this humbleness that it's like, even though I'm scared, even though I see the challenges of the cross, even though I don't want to die on the cross, God, it's not about what I feel in this moment, but it's about your will for me, Father. So not my will, but thy will be done. And thus Jesus conquers the ultimate evil. He conquers even death itself is defeated. And it's done in an unconventional way. The way that God defeats death is by dying. But even in this death, it's a total radical trust and belief in God. So in our own lives, if we want to have victories over the temptations and sins, over this evil snakes in our life, we do it by humbly trusting God, by having this radical faith that no matter what things look like, even though it may appear that this challenge, this temptation, this evil thing in my life is more powerful than I am, really, because God is on our side, if we humbly trust him and follow him, we can overcome any challenge, any evil in our life.